Hey everyone, today on Big Al Books, I'm going to be discussing two famous works of Latin American magical realism. The first one is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and the second one being The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. So if you've either read these books or know a little bit about them, then you'll know that it's almost impossible to not compare them to each other. They have so many similarities. They are both multi-generational family sagas with somewhat cursed families at the heart of the story. Both authors use the multiple generations of these families to go through the political history of their own countries. So House of the Spirit explores the political turbulence happening in Chile, and 100 Years of Solitude is about Colombia. And they're both famous works of the magical realism genre, where these somewhat fantastical events happen in a kind of mundane, everyday manner. If you're expecting this review to be a fair and balanced analysis comparing both of these works, then you're going to be disappointed because I'm going to be upfront that I am really biased in favor towards 100 Years of Solitude. I think that it is the vastly superior work of the two. So this video is going to be a little bit more comparing the similarities of these books and why I think 100 Years of Solitude is more effective at what it does. Let's begin by talking about writing style. So I'm going to read the opening line of both of these novels. This is the first line from The House of the Spirits. Barabbas came to us by sea, the child Clara wrote in her delicate calligraphy. So that opening line doesn't really do much for me. It has a little bit of a sense of mystery in that we don't know who Barabbas is or what he is and why he's traveling by sea. But really, this line didn't hook me too much. It just kind of launches straight into the story. Here's the opening line of 100 Years of Solitude. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. So I love that opening line because we know that one of the main characters is going to be facing a fire squad in the future, so that builds some tension and excitement about what's going to happen in the plot. As well, this idea of discovering ice is very intriguing. I think especially to me as someone who's living in a northern country, because ice is so everyday for me. I mean, the winter, I'm just surrounded by ice. I slip on it on my driveway every morning. So this concept to me of people actually going and discovering ice was really intriguing. And that's the case of the people living in this South American climate before refrigeration, where they see this block of ice and it's this total marvel. And that's partly what I love about what Gabriel Garcia Marquez does with his writing, is he makes these everyday concepts and ideas seem so magical and fantastical. So these things that I don't really think about very often, he imbues with the sense of life and mystery and wonder. That's part of the reason why I love the magical realism in this book so much. It's not just used to spice up the story, although there are some memorable moments, like when the town goes through this contagious insomnia plague and no one can sleep, but also it's used to give the sense of enchantment to the story and these everyday moments, not just the boring ones, but also these sad and significant moments, like when one of the main characters dies and these beautiful golden flowers rain down over the town, or when one character dies and this line of blood travels through the whole town past all these people leading to one person directly. It's these memorable moments that make it so worth it. The magical realism in 100 Years of Solitude is so deeply connected with imagery and creates this rich poetic element to the book. Whereas in The House of the Spirits, the magical realism isn't nearly as memorable, and most of it has to do with the character named Clara, who has these clairvoyant tendencies. There are some characters who are somewhat psychic, they have visions, try to communicate with the dead, things like that. There's one memorable scene where Clara has a vision where to find her dead mother's head. It's been cut off from her body in a car accident, so she's just going off in the fields, roaming around with this dead mother's head, and then they just keep it in the house for years afterwards. So that scene was funny, but most of the other scenes that had to do with magical realism really didn't stick out in my memory, and this book does read as quite realistic and straightforward for the most part. Both of these novels have a strong sense of setting, and you will learn more about Chile and Colombia after reading these books. So both authors are not just using these multiple generations of these families as a plot device, but they're using it to cover a wide span of time so that they can fill in a lot of history, and you can see how things have changed and grown over the years. So in The House of the Spirits, this novel becomes quite deeply political. Most of this book is about the patriarch of the family, Esteban Trueba, and he starts off as this young guy who really wants to make something of himself, and he works really hard so that he can buy land. So a lot of this book has to do with land ownership and the reforms that happened over the years. So, eventually this guy has to start paying his workers decent salaries and not just coupons, and he has to start educating the people that are living on his land. This book deals with the growing tensions between the political parties as the established conservatives are trying to do what they can to hold on to their power, and yet more and more people are demanding change and turning towards the socialist government. And a lot of this book has to do with Isabel Allende's own experiences growing up in Chile. So her uncle was actually the first elected socialist president, and he was in fact assassinated in a military coup by General Pinochet, who's kind of an infamous guy, and all of this is described in the book. She writes convincingly about the difficulties of living through these times of political hardship, especially when people that you cared about were just going missing and not returning. So in some ways, it's a strength of the novel to learn about these political realities, but at the same time, it's a drastic shift in tone. So the first 300 pages of this book are kind of taking you through the stories of this family, and it's mostly lighthearted, and then all of a sudden these last 100 pages happen, and they are just really intense, like social realism, violence. There's not a lot of humor or joy in the storytelling anymore, and I thought that that shift was really jarring in not the most effective kind of way. In some ways, I think that The House of the Spirits is a little too caught up in its own specific time and place, whereas 100 Years of Solitude has much more of a broader appeal, because while it can teach you a lot about the development of Colombia, it's more of a universal story. And when this book begins, it almost has this Adam and Eve feel, where you feel like you're at like the beginning of civilization, where this couple in this book set up and create a new town from scratch, and they are living in these backwoods of Colombia, and they're not connected really much with the rest of society. Like Jose Arcadio, who is like the father of this family, discovers that the earth travels around the sun and not the opposite on his own, because he doesn't have access to science and technology at the beginning of this book. So it really feels like you're at the beginning of time, and you go through all the generations of this family, and by the end of the book it feels like it has been the apocalypse and you've reached the end of time. So it has a much more all-encompassing kind of scope. This book is also concerned with the military conflicts between the opposing conservative and liberal governments, and one of the main characters is a colonel in the army who leads these rebel forces. But whereas in The House of the Spirits, Allende comes across as quite sympathetic towards the socialist causes, 100 Years of Solitude, it's a lot more detached and world-weary, especially seen through the eyes of Colonel Aureliano Buendia. He is so fatigued by his time in the war. He's so disenchanted. He realizes that both sides are just kind of power-hungry and corrupt, and there isn't really righteousness on either side. So this book is a lot more jaded about politics. Sometimes this book has a dark view on human progress. So the railroad in this town is a symbol of civilization and progress forward and technology, and you think it's going to be this good thing because it connects the town to the rest of the country, but it also has its very grim effects. So when this foreign company comes in to set up this exploitive banana operation, and some of the workers go on strike to protest this, and basically almost everyone is gunned down, and their dead bodies are removed on this railroad. So while the railway is linked with promise and opportunity, it's also linked with death and exploitation and covering up that this event ever even happened because the bodies are removed, the press never finds out. There's only one character who has witnessed this event, and he essentially goes crazy because nobody else knows that this tragedy has occurred. 100 Years of Solitude features 7 generations of one family, so it is able to cover an impressive amount of history in the story. And I think that is one of the points that loses a lot of people with this novel, is that it is pretty confusing. I mean, there is a family tree included at the beginning of the novel, and you will need to refer to it frequently because a lot of people in this family are given the same names generation after generation, so it can be pretty easy to lose track and forget who's who. Now, personally, I think that this is a really great decision because through the repetition of the names, you also get repetitions of characteristics. So you know if you meet a Jose Arcadio that they are going to be physically imposing and very impulsive, whereas if you meet an Aureliano, they're going to be quite removed and intellectual. The repetition of the names also shows the cyclical nature of time, as these same events keep happening generation after generation, and these same character flaws are passed down through the names of the characters. We especially see this through the perspective of the matriarch of this family, Ursula, who lives to be 100 years old. And she goes blind, but she's realizing that certain things in the family just keep happening. It gets to the point where 2 twin boys are born in the family, and Ursula thinks that they have switched places during childhood and they've just lost track of who is who, because all of a sudden Aureliano is acting a lot more like a Jose Arcadio and vice versa. So it's a really interesting play on identity and how these traits are passed along in this family. And what I like about this novel is that the character flaws and the fatal flaws, the things that are going to bring this family down eventually, are passed down through all of the generations. Like, these are issues that most of the Buendia men struggle with. So they struggle with their solitude, and they work hard to learn things, but they keep this knowledge all to themselves, or they have these impulsive personalities. They have a few traits that are just passed on through the generations. Whereas in the House of the Spirits, we are mostly dealing with a flawed patriarch of the family, and most of the sins and the revenge that's going to happen in the story is because of this one man's actions. And he is a pretty hateful man, so a lot of this comes from the sexual violence that he commits as a landowner. Some people call this book a feminist retelling of 100 Years of Solitude, and I do admire the way that it challenges the systemic violence that was so prevalent in the culture. So really, anyone in a position of power was often abusing it. So we have the patriarch of this family, but we also see people who are quite high up officials in the military that are abusing their power in the prison camps at the end of the book in really disturbing ways. So this book does describe a lot of sexual violence, but it is really challenging it. Although one thing that I found strange is that the patriarch of this family, Esteban, is clearly like this terrible guy, yet I feel like the book was really trying to humanize him in a lot of ways, and there were a few narrative sections that were from his perspective and trying to like soften his story and provide his take, and I felt like that wasn't really necessary, and that I didn't really want to hear the nice things that he's done or the way that he sees it after a scene where you've just read about him knocking out all of his wife's teeth in a fight. So I really didn't appreciate that element of the book, and I thought it would have been stronger without those sections. There is also a lot of sexual violence in 100 Years of Solitude, but it is kind of seen as more a part of everyday life, and it's not really challenged or confronted. And in fact, in this book, there seems to be a link between sexuality and violence, and a lot of couples in this book go through these passionate struggles where they're almost fighting before it leads to sex. So that can be a little bit uncomfortable in some ways because it's not very clear-cut or consensual always, so this book isn't quite as satisfying to look through a feminist lens. If you haven't read either of these books and you're not sure which one to start off with, I think it will really depend on what you find to be satisfying as a reader as to which book you're going to like better. If this is your first foray into magical realism and you want a plot that's a little bit more linear and straightforward, if you want some entertaining anecdotes and good storytelling and some intense love stories, then The House of the Spirits could be a really good place to start off with. However, if you are looking for a work that is more challenging, if you are not afraid to be a little confused and lost at times, and if you want a work that is deeply enriching and powerful and truly unique, then 100 Years of Solitude is a must-read book. I do think that this book is the much stronger of the two, but I am more of a pretentious reader where I'm looking for that more highly literary quality. So for those reasons, I just found this book to be more engrossing and thought-provoking and a lot more memorable once I put the book down. So you can't go wrong reading either of them, but I would say 100 Years of Solitude is the winner in the battle of the classic Latin American magical realism books. Not that reading is a competition, but you know, if it were. But if you have read either of these books, I would love to hear your comments, because I know it can be pretty polarizing as to whether people prefer The House of the Spirits or 100 Years of Solitude. So if you have anything to say about these books, I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. That is it from me today. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.